Do you want to, for anybody maybe that didn't read it, do you want to tell us what the apology is?
Well, first of all, thanks everybody so much for coming out tonight. There's so many people I love here and know here so well for so many years, and for the new people, I'm so blessed that you've come. I'm going to set up the book a little bit. I am the survivor of childhood sexual abuse from the time I was 5 until the time I was 10, at which point my father then began to physically abuse me in kind of violent ways, almost murdering me twice until the age of 18. And I think all my life, when my father was alive, I dreamed there would be a point where he would apologize to me. As a matter of fact, I was always writing him apology letters, one, because I always felt like I was sorry and bad and terrible because he made me feel that way, but also I kind of thought it would inspire him to do the same. And then he died, and he's been dead 31 years, and I still have been yearning for his apology. So take that, and then there's this other piece of it, which is I've been actively involved in the movement, as are many women here tonight. I want to honor all the women and men who've been fighting to stop violence against women, all women and girls, for many years. And I think with the recent iteration of Me Too, we've seen women tell our stories. We've seen women call out men. We've seen women break the silence. We've been doing the work, women. We've been doing the work. But in fact, violence against all women has never been our issue. Turns out we don't rape ourselves. And all this time, I was thinking, I have never heard a man make a public, authentic, thorough apology for sexual abuse. And maybe in 16,000 years of patriarchy. And so I thought to myself, that's really incredible. And that must be something central to the story. So I decided, I was in Congo last summer, and I decided there that I was going to write my father's apology. And I was going to say all the things I needed to hear. I was going to express it in the way I needed to hear it. And I was going to write it for him as a way of freeing myself and really of the last vestiges of the story, but also maybe as a possible blueprint for other men and other perpetrators and abusers that they might find their way to this process. So we're going to hear a few clips, like excerpts. There's a wonderful man named Eduardo Ballerini who did the audio. And these are just little sections of the book. They're I guess, linear, but they're way out of place. Just to give you a snapshot of the book, I just want to warn you that they're upsetting. They can be upsetting and disturbing, so just be prepared for that, because I don't want it to just come at you. So we can hear the clips now.
How very strange to be writing you. Am I writing to you from the grave, or the past, or the future? Am I writing as you, or as you would like me to be, or as I really am beneath my own limited understanding? And does it matter? Am I writing in a language I never spoke or understood, which you have created inside both of our minds to bridge the gaps, the failures to connect? Maybe I am writing as I truly am, as you have freed me by your witness. Or I'm not writing this at all, but simply being used as a vehicle to fulfill your own needs and version of things. You always wrote me letters. I found that peculiar and strangely moving. We lived in the same house, but you were writing to me. Your little girl handwriting attempting straight lines, but wandering all over the page. It was as if you were trying to make contact with some aspect of me, a part you could not find in the heated moments of our conflict, as if you were trying through poetry to appeal to a secret self that I had once made available to you. Usually you wrote apology letters. So fitting that you would now want an apology letter from me. You were always apologizing, begging for forgiveness. I had reduced you to a daily degrading mantra of, "I'm sorry." This apology required time. It could not be rushed. Fortunately, I have had practice here, endlessly reliving and rehashing my crimes, mentally reenacting the details. I know you have said that an apology must be thorough, and can only be trusted in its veracity and dedication to details. I have done my best. I have followed your very strict guidelines. Recognize what I have done as a crime. Face how deeply my actions and violations have impacted and devastated you. See you as a human being. Attempt to experience or feel what it felt like inside you. Feel profound remorse and regret over my actions. And finally, take responsibility for my actions by doing extensive work to understand what made me do what I did. I will need to go back in this letter to locate the roots of my behavior. I will be as honest as a formerly disingenuous person can be. I will attempt to proceed with neither defensiveness nor self-pity, as I understand neither will further clarify nor resolve. I would find myself in your room at some twilight hour. I only felt alive between the daylight and darkness, in that crepuscular realm where dream and memory are indecipherable. That's how I controlled you. Those aphotic hours where others in the house were lost in sleep and you were in a trance, separated from your body. I would find myself sitting on your bed, somehow carried there by shadow men. You would pretend to be asleep, as if what was happening was not happening. You desperately wanted it and me to go away. I didn't go away. I never spoke, never uttered a sound. The silence was my power. Words would break the spell, make it real and ugly and what it was. What kind of bastard have I been? What kind of destruction have I wrought? I have lied, and lied to myself and you. I cursed your future of love. At 5, I took your body. You didn't give it to me. I contaminated your sweetness. I ripped the protective golden gates from your garden. I betrayed your trust. I rearranged your sexual chemistry and the basis of your desire. Wrongness and excitement were forever fused together. I made my stain. I left my stinking mark. I infected you. By invading and overwhelming your body, I killed your yearning so early. You did not and could not give me permission. There was no consent. You did not seduce me with your crinoline petticoats. You were simply being an adorable child. I overstimulated your 5-year-old body and planted the seeds of intensity and thrill. You would push yourself too far, take heroin, jump off bridges, drive 100 miles an hour. I robbed you of the ordinary. I destroyed your notion of family. I forced you to betray your mother. You lived in perpetual self-hatred and guilt. I created hierarchy, distrust, and violent competition between you and your siblings. None of you would recover from this. I robbed you of agency over your body. You didn't make any decisions. You didn't say yes. That was my projection in order to satisfy my needs. You were 5 years old. I was 52. You had no sovereignty. I exploited and abused you. I took your body. It was no longer yours. I rendered you passive. You compulsively gave it to whoever wanted it because I taught you you should. I forced you out of your body, and because you were dislocated and numb, you were unable to protect yourself. I compromised your safety and ability to defend yourself. I made it so that rape became what turned you on. I eviscerated your necessary boundaries so you never knew what was yours and when to say no or how to say stop. I tore the delicate walls of your vagina and made it vulnerable to disease and infection. Your body didn't and couldn't say yes. This was a convenient lie I told myself. You didn't know it was sex. I took what I needed by convincing myself you needed it too. I exploited your adoration. I forced you into secrecy, to lie to your mother, to develop a dual life. This split you in two. I made you feel like a whore. I made you feel you were never worthy of legitimate love. I made intimacy claustrophobic. I left my poison in you. I destroyed your memory, by making you want to forget everything. This impacted your intelligence and ability to contain facts and take tests. I stole your innocence. I dimmed your life force and made you feel your sexuality was the cause of bad things. I used your being and body to serve myself. I did all this. Eve, let me say these words. I am sorry. I am sorry. Let me sit here at the final hour. Let me get it right this time. Let me be staggered by your tenderness. Let me risk fragility. Let me be rendered vulnerable. Let me be lost. Let me be still. Let me not occupy or oppress. Let me not conquer or destroy. Let me bathe in the rapture. Let me be the father. Let me be the father who mirrors your kind-heartedness back to you. Let me lay no claims. Let me bear witness and not invade. Eve, I free you from the covenant. I revoke the lie. I lift the curse. Old man, be gone.
Um, it's so interesting hearing a man's voice when you read it and you interject how you would hear it. How is that for you listening back? You've been on this tour doing this every other day. I mean, it must be, is it excruciating? Is it liberating? How does it make you feel to hear your own words back to you?
I think the first time I heard a man read it, it was really, really eerie and strange. Although I've been hearing my father in my head all through this whole process. But I don't know, I feel in a weird way just so happy he's saying it. And so happy to hear a man saying it out loud, in public, in our midst. And as weird as it feels and as disturbing as it is, there's something so liberating about the truth, right? When the truth is the truth, and when you're waiting for the truth and you're waiting to hear the truth, when it's said, as painful as it is, there's just an incredible release that happens, you know? And I think, we've been on this tour now for 5 weeks, just city to city, country to country. And it's almost like some kind of wild shamanic experience where it's like burning away, talking about it. But I also feel there's something so moving to me about going from city to city and meeting people who have had such similar experiences. I can't tell you the stories I've heard and what people say to me when I'm signing books and how many men have been coming and talking about their desire to find ways to get free. I've been really moved by that. So I don't know. It's both. It's what writing the book was. It was excruciating and revelatory and liberating, and it was all in one bite.
But you've been doing this work your whole life, and you've been writing these amazing pieces and plays and confronting so much of it all the time. It's not like you've been in denial your whole life and this is the first time. You tell the stories of so many women and help them use their own voices, and yet this particular project in Congo, you felt like it was the time to write it after all these years. What was like that impetus that day that it just came to you and you said, this is still something I need to do?
Well, I think there are two things. I feel in a way we're at a stalemate in our movement. We've called men out. We've found our voices. We've said this is real. We've put it in, it's finally, after all our 70 years of a movement to end violence against women and girls, it's finally front page news. Finally people are paying attention to it. And yet, the other side is not responding in kind. right? And so it feels like if we're going to move forward, if we're really going to bring about change, the next step is apology. The next step is accountability. The next step is reckoning. The next step is deep self-interrogation on the part of men to say, and maybe I can just go into this. I mean, one of the things I learned in this book is what is an apology, right? We teach children how to pray, right? We teach them the devotion of prayer and the humility of the petition. But we don't teach children how to apologize. An apology is a process. It's a practice. And writing this book, I really began to kind of outline the anatomy of...
Or we teach them the wrong way, the way that say you're sorry,
Exactly.
which is not coming from a real, true place.
Exactly. It's like, and then we're over it,
Yeah.
right? But in writing this book, I think what I had to do is outline the anatomy of an apology and the tenets of an apology. And first of all, it's a humbling. It's making yourself vulnerable. It's an equalizer. There's no one on top, there's no one on bottom. We are in this together. We are looking at one another across the table. And I think we live in a country, I think we all can agree, of kind of diabolical amnesia, right? We don't remember our origins, beginning with the indigenous who we committed genocide against and robbed them of lands and raped and pillaged and destroyed, moving on to African Americans who we enslaved for 400 years, and then on to Jim Crow and mass incarceration. We don't remember any of that, and we certainly haven't apologized for any of that. But then if we look at our families, we're forgetting things as they're happening. Right? Denial is so immediate. It's like, oh, that's not happening. We're erasing it. And I think what an apology is an antidote to amnesia. It says what occurred did occur. What happened is real. The next piece of it is that I think it's really, really important that the person who's apologizing actually feels what happened inside the person he abused, to open himself to the impact not only then, but as he's apologizing. What was the impact on her and her family and her community, on the rest of her life? How did that impact her? And then I think a big piece of this is going back in your own history and saying, how did I become an abuser? How did I become a man who harasses women, or a man who rapes women, or a man who degrades women? I don't believe that men are born pedophiles or born with machetes in their hands. I think it's absolutely acculturated in this toxic patriarchy that men are bred into. And what my father taught me in this book, because he went back into his own history and looked at what were the steps that made him the person he was, is that he was born a tender boy full of wonder and awe and curiosity and open-heartedness, and it was like zapped out of him, zapped out of him, zapped out of him. And so that's a huge part of the apology, is like, what made me this? And then the last part is accountability. I take responsibility for what I've done, and I am sorry, indicating that I've gone through a process which bears witness to the fact I could never do anything like this again. That is the journey of an apology. And it's not, I'm sorry if I made you feel bad, or I'm sorry if I sexually abused you. That's not an apology. Or I'm sorry if that was it turned out bad for you, which is what we usually hear. And we have to open the pathway in our country, in our culture, in our communities, for these apologies now to be made.
I found it extremely, I know it's part of the process, the healing process, and perhaps you can talk more about forgiveness, who the burden is on to forgive, and forgiveness, and perhaps maybe we never forgive in a case like this, and it's more about acceptance. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when you say you're liberated and this experience is, you did seem like you felt lighter backstage when we were talking about it. How do you find that in yourself? And I just lost track. I was just, I'm so sorry. This must happen to people. I was thinking about when when you're traumatized, and I do this a lot in my own life, and then you block out things and you can't speak. And I was actually brought to what you were saying, how you couldn't take tests and you couldn't think straight. It's like these voices that are trying to keep you from being able to be your best self. It's like you're constantly punishing yourself, and I really related to that. But where was I before?
No, you were great. You were asking about forgiveness.
Yes, the forgiveness and acceptance. Right. Thank you. And and I guess, do you forgive your father, or have you just accepted your experience in life?
I've always been wary of the word forgiveness. It kind of gives me the creeps, because I always feel it's like has this religious implication, and it's always been mandated. Like you will I hear people say to victims of all kinds and survivors of all kinds, why don't you forgive him and get over it, or why don't you forgive him? And I've just heard that so often. It's almost like the next abuse that happens to people. What I believe in is the alchemy of the apology. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I think that when somebody makes a thorough, authentic apology, like I've just outlined, and you're in the presence of that, something actually happens in your body, in your mind, in your spirit. It's almost like you can feel the tentacles of rancor, of hatred, of bitterness, of all the things just going choo, 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 choo. And I have to say, over the course of writing this book, and granted, I was writing my father's apology to me, but I will tell you, I want to talk about that later, because I think there's huge power in doing that. I could feel things beginning to release in me. And I know anytime I have received in my life a genuine apology, when it's over, I'm done. I'm done. I'm not carrying any kind of negativity towards that person. I feel we've moved on. And at the end of this book, I had this really, really, really powerful experience where when my father says that line to me, "Old man, be gone," I was a big fan of Peter Pan and Tinkerbell, and remember at the end of Peter Pan, Tinkerbell just goes, shoo. That's what it felt like. It felt like my father just went, whoosh. And he's been gone since then. He's been gone. Like, he's been gone. And if that's forgiveness, I'm all for it. I'm all for it. But I take issue with the mandate and the onus being on victims to forgive. It's not up to us to forgive. That's another job. It's not my job. If you want to make a thorough, deep, powerful, true, self-interrogated, self-reckoning apology, it will do its work for you and me simultaneously, because that's what happens.
So what do you think is, because we were sort of talking about this, harder to forgive or to ask for forgiveness?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I think we make a huge deal about apologizing. We make it like it's this impossible thing. And, in the book, my father says this really interesting thing to me. He says, to be an apologist is to be a traitor to men. And it really hit me when he said it, because I really feel like he said it. I would not know that. And what I realized is there is a code between men, which is we don't apologize. And that keeps the columns in patriarchy in their place, right? It keeps everything, because once one man says, I was wrong and I actually knew I was wrong, it means all of them know what they're doing, and the whole story is going to collapse, right? And in a way, what we need right now is I always think of Castro saying we only need 10% of the people to have a revolution. What we need is 10% of the men now to be gender traitors, to really come forward and say, I'm going to break with the patriarchy. I'm going to come forward and say, I know what I'm doing is wrong, and I'm going to start going through a reckoning process to clean this up. Because we had to be really brave as women. We had to break our silence. We had to put ourselves out there and face humiliation. I mean, look what women go through when they tell their stories. Look at the bashings they get. Look at the hate they get. Look at the torture they get. Look at the disbelief and the delegitimization and all the horrible things that, if we can do that after being abused, men can certainly be brave enough now to start with apologies. My God.
So, as an artist, how does one, how do you, how do you remain so loving and generous, having experienced such extreme pain and trauma in your life? How do you find that? How do you find the depth in your soul to give back the way that you do?
I don't know. I think there are two things that have saved my life. One was my imagination, because I think if I hadn't had an imagination, I would have perished a long time ago. I had imaginary friends who I would imagine were coming to save me. I had a very dear friend named Mr. Alligator, and when things would get really bad and really violent, I would call him on the telephone. We had the rotary dial things in those days, and I would speak really loudly, and I'd be like, "Mr. Alligator, it's time to come." And so everyone would, obviously hear me and know it was a bad moment for me. And of course, everyone made fun of that and thought that was pathetic. But I would pack my little suitcase, and I would put my crayons in it, my orange in it, and I'd walk to the end of the block, and I'd wait for Mr. Alligator to come. And it was this really beautiful little path through my lawn, and I'd sit there and I'd just wait all day. And, he didn't come, but I would always have good reasons, like there were other children who were hurting worse than I was, and he needed to go to them first, and he was going to get to my house later, and maybe he was going to come that day, but I knew he was coming. And I always tell this story, if I just say the story, because I really do believe the imagination is the greatest gift we have. And Rilke once said that the future enters into us in order to transform itself within us long before it ever happens. And I think this projected idea of a better future is what saved me. And many years later, after this story, I was in Narok, Kenya. And I had gone there, I was researching a play called The Good Body. And I had heard about a woman who was stopping the practice of female genital mutilation. And I arrived in this little town called Narok, Kenya, and there was this amazing woman who's been my hero ever since that day, called Agnes Pareo. And Agnes was literally in this little schoolroom, and she had a box, and in it was an anatomical vagina, and she was teaching girls and boys of the Maasai community what a healthy vagina looked like and what a mutilated vagina looked like. And she had been literally walking through the Rift Valley, because the Maasai are nomads, and she was walking for years through the Rift Valley with her box, stopping at every family, teaching them, and in the time she had walked, she had saved 1,500 girls from being cut. And so when we met her, I fell in love with her, and I just said, "What could we do to help you?" And she said, "Well, Eve, if you got me a Jeep, I could get around a lot faster." So in the first year, we got her a Jeep, and she saved 4,500 girls from being cut. So I said, "What else could we do for you, Agnes?" Because now I'm devoted to her. And she said, "Well, if you gave me money, I could open a house, and girls could run away, and they could be protected, because we now have a law in Kenya, and I could keep them there until I could reconcile them with their families." So we gave her money, and the day I went for the opening of the house, I arrived in the car, and I could hear this unbelievable singing and dancing in the distance, and I was shaking. I was so excited and moved to get out of the car, and I got out of the car, and all these young, beautiful girls who had had their clitorises saved were like walking me down, came to greet me, and they were singing, and they were all dressed in red, and there were just all these Maasai beautiful outfits, and I looked down, and it was the exact path of my childhood. The same stone, the same everything, leading right to the house. And I realized it was 40 some odd years later, but Mr. Alligator had finally come. And really, that is the imagination. We have to imagine where we're going. We have to see, and particularly right now, we have to imagine where we're going. So I think it was imagination, and I think there were really kind people along the way who saw me, who saw me and didn't let me fall all the way to the bottom of the pit,
Yeah, you're also Mr. Alligator yourself, so. Or Mrs. Alligator, or whatever. No Mr. or Mrs. How did you take care of yourself when you were writing this? How long did it take you to write it? How would you What was the self-care? Or did you not need it? Was it just like flowing out? And how would you just logistically write this book?
This book was like a fever. It's the only way I can describe it. It was like a trance fever. And I think once I literally, except for leaving for a week in the middle of it, or maybe it was 10 days, once I decided to write it, I kind of went into 4 months, morning, noon, and night, of just being inside it. I didn't talk to anyone. I couldn't see anyone. I was just in it. And I felt possessed by it, to be honest with you. And I really learned something about the dead, that the dead are all around us all the time, and they really need to be in dialogue with us. Some of them are really struggling to be free. Some are struggling to figure out how to get out of certain places and zones that they're in. And I think once I opened the portal to my father, he came in. But I also think that as survivors, when a person rapes you or beats you or violates you or enters you or demeans you, they actually come inside you and they become embedded in you. They become part of you. And whether I was conscious of it or not, for all of my life, I've been in dialogue with that person, that embedded abuser inside me. I know that certain things in my life happen, and I'm always proving to that person, you see, you were wrong, or you see, you didn't, and I'm always negotiating with that person. And so what I realized writing this book was really profound, which is that we can actually move those introjects, those embedded beings, in another direction. So rather than being at the mercy of that person, I suddenly went, no, I'm going to make you my apologist. And so monster became apologist. Terrifying entity became broken, fragile, wounded boy. And in doing that, he lost all power over me. I got agency over him. And so it's interesting because I think survivors often know their abusers better than they know anybody in the world. I mean, particularly if they're in your family, because you know the sound of their steps, you know the lilt in their voice, whether they've had 2 cocktails or 5, you know what their mood is, you can feel them approaching, and you are often, if you're an empathetic person, which most children are, you're often feeling the feelings they're not feeling. You're picking up their melancholy, you're picking up their sadness, you're picking up whatever they've pushed down. So I think the good news is that this exercise is a really powerful thing, and I would highly recommend it if you can't get an apology from your perpetrator, but obviously doing it with support, doing it with therapy, doing it with counselor, doing it with clergy, to really, and at City of Joy, a month ago, which is our revolutionary center and sanctuary in the Congo, run by this amazing woman, Christine Schuler-Describer, they did this exercise a month ago, and the reaction of the survivors was so powerful. And she came into her office a week ago, and she had a pile of letters on her desk. They'd just been writing all night. And so I think it's a really powerful thing to shift how, of really liberating oneself from the control of that embedded being inside you.
And yet I found myself conflicted reading it for you, hearing exactly what you're saying, and I think that's maybe the process a lot of women go through is seeing a monster as the little boy and what happened to him. But I also felt like I was, I guess, astounded by your ability to give him, to allow us as readers to see him as a human being. You know, I kind of didn't want you to do that. It was, and yet I understand that, but I'm sure for you, it really seemed like such a generous place to go when you're angry, to be able to do that and give him, because some of us or our parents, you know, we know people, we're traumatized ourselves, and we do the the work to become better people and better parents, and some people go the opposite, as in your dad. So I don't know, did you find that you made the decision to give that to him and allow us to see that reality of his abuse?
I just want to say the book is an offering. It's not a prescription. Every survivor doesn't want to do this, and every survivor doesn't want to hear an apology or receive an apology, and so it's not a have to. I know for me, I was carrying anger around, and as my father says in the book, it's a poison you mix for a friend, but you drink yourself. I didn't want to be a slave to my anger anymore. I don't want to live in a victim-perpetrator reality anymore. So I wanted to see if I could go someplace new. And I have to say, having worked in a prison for 8 years with long-term, inmates who had done violent crimes, we live in a very punishing country. Our whole country is about punishment. Punishment and violence, punishment and violence. It's just a cycle of it. We have more incarcerated people here, mainly black and brown people here, than any country in the entire world. We raise people up and then we execute them. We make stars out of people and then we demolish them. We punish. And we have more guns than we have people in this country. Okay, punishment, violence. I want to end the cycle of punishment and violence. And what that means is that we have to get underneath why people do what they do. We have to go back and say what in people's stories, what in the oppression, what in racial injustice, what in economic injustice, what in gender injustice, what made you and brought you to be who you are, if we don't want to perish as human beings. Because I think we're very close to that point. I think we're very close to becoming extinct. And if we continue with this cycle, and we have, unfortunately, at the head of this country, the manifestation, in my opinion, of the history of this country. He is the manifestation of it. He's not a singular entity. He is literally our reckoning. We are at our reckoning point. And if we don't reckon with our history, we are going to perish. So it's not that I let my father justify his behavior. He explained his behavior in order not to keep repeating that behavior for all of eternity. And by doing that, I got freed, because I'll tell you something that all survivors are obsessed with is the why. Why? Why did my best friend drug me and rape me? Why did someone beat me up on the street because I'm a black person? Why did my father want to destroy me because I'm his daughter? That why becomes our obsession. And I think when we can begin to look in someone's own history and say, this led to this, led to this, led to this, it begins to make sense.
Well, it's hard. It's something I'm experiencing. I don't want to detract this from the book, but I'm a mother of my son is black, and they were just reading this. He's 9, and they were just reading this story in school, and it had like this young girl, Asian girl. It's from the 90s. So the author is writing about when she was a little girl. Their family owned a motel. She would work behind the front desk, and there were all these different walks of life that would come in. And the teacher pulls me aside. I go in to pick up my son Walker, and she says, "We had a day today. Your son was visibly emotionally upset because there was like a racial profiling moment in the book where one of this really mean white guy was accusing the really great black guy of stealing something at the motel. And so we had to go home and talk about this. And he was saying that exact thing. Why, Mommy? I just don't understand. Why do people are going to hate me just because of my skin? And I'm so trying to figure out the exact right things to say as the white, privileged, ignorant mom, how to do this right, and I did. I tried to explain that there's going to be this balance, and that we're in this world, and it's complicated, and there's going to come a time where you're going to have to see that there's bad and there's good and there's in between and all that stuff. But I should have called you to help me talk to my son.
But it's really about that why. It's really about looking at that why, and getting underneath it. And sometimes maybe there isn't a why, but I think the investigation of it is what we're doing here. What makes us people who are capable of one of the things I learned in my father, and this was really profound, is that my father was adored, right? He was adored. He was a child who was born like 12 years after the last child. He was the golden boy. He was the miracle. He was the mistake that was now the miracle, right? And he was going to bring the family to this new level of, And so my father was not loved. He was adored. And adoration is not love, and we do this to boys. Adoration is a projection of my idealized idea of you onto you, which you will now live up to for me, right? It does not allow you to be yourself. It does not allow you to be wondrous or lost or tender or confused or doubtful or sorrowful or any of the things human beings are. It allows you a certain box that you will fit yourself into. And so what do you do with your feelings of tenderness? What do you do with your feelings when you want to cry? What do you do with wonder when you're not allowed wonder, when you have to be assured of yourself and you can't express curiosity or you can't express doubt? You push it underground, you push it underground, and you separate yourself from those feelings and you separate those selves. And so eventually what happened to my father is they metastasized into what he calls the shadow man. And that being, that persona, that split off part of him, when I was born, he had huge feelings of tenderness. And rather than being a person who had been treated tenderly or had learned to be tender with himself or had been able to express tenderness, he had no idea what to do with it. And so it overwhelmed him. And rather than being able to sit with it and go, the way I feel about my granddaughters, I look at my granddaughters and I sometimes just want to weep. They're so precious. They're so tender, they're so beautiful, they're so perfect. I just want to break down crying about it. But I've learned to sit with that and to have those feelings. But if you don't know how to do that, you want to stop it, you want to attack it, you want to rape it, you want to kill it, you want to exploit it, you want to make it go away. And so we don't teach our boys, and I don't think my father's that different than so many people. What he did maybe, but I think childhood sexual abuse is rampant in this country, rampant. And if it's being exposed this big in the church, do you think that's the only place it's happening? So obviously we're bringing up boys in a way where we are robbing them of their humanity. We are separating them from their tenderness. We are cutting off their hearts. We are not letting them express their sparkle, their dazzle, their wonder, their curiosity. And so why are we surprised when we hear that our 18-year-old son is lying on top of a girl, raping her when she's screaming, stop? They're not even feeling what she's feeling because they're not feeling. So I think these are the kind of things that I uncovered doing this book. And I think if we don't uncover that, we're just going to keep doing this and doing this and doing this forever for the 11 years we have left, if the climate scientists are right, Just saying.
Well, what should we do, Eve? How do we get Mitch McConnell to write an apology letter? I don't know. Like some scary shit has to go down in order to change stuff. I mean, it was like 9/11, all of a sudden New Yorkers were like talking to each other. I mean, we have to really go through some horrible, horrible reckoning in order to change. What do you think that is?
But you know what I think it's beginning to happen. I do, and even the way I have to say, no one's given up on this apology thing. People keep going back. I saw this great article today saying Joe Biden should be on the apology tour. Anita Hill was not satisfied with that apology, and she was right. She was right. And if you're going to apologize, apologize. Go through the steps and model what that looks like. Be accountable. Anita Hill was delegitimized, was humiliated, was desecrated publicly. But it wasn't just Anita Hill. It was millions of women in this country and throughout the world who were desecrated, delegitimized, and humiliated. Not to mention putting Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court for eternity, who is making decisions now about our bodies, right? There is a huge piece and then where were you, Joe Biden, at that moment? Who were you siding up to? Why were you making calls to Clarence Thomas? Why were you in that covert relationship? There's a whole piece of this story you have to come out with and talk about. And I think if I have to say, one of the most encouraging things about doing this book tour has been the men who have been inviting me on their shows, who have been interviewing me, who have been writing really thoughtful, beautiful pieces.
What's an example of something?
A beautiful, I'm blocking out his name, Ron wrote a beautiful piece in the Washington Post. Mark Moran had me on a show and really just blew my mind, talking about how this book is like the geometry of toxic masculinity and just talking about it for an hour with me. But it's been like, I've been really surprised how many men are coming forward to really say we are looking for pathways. How do we begin to create pathways where we can tell the truth? You know, and I saw an article the other day about Al Franken, like, what are we to do with Al Franken? Well, I think what we're to do, Al Franken is to do with Al Franken. Al Franken, do the work. Come forward and talk about how you ended up in this situation, what you went through, what are the things in your story that led you to do the things you did? And then come forward and make amends for it. I don't think we'll hold you responsible for eternity if you tell the truth. I won't. I'm ready to go through a process of that alchemy that I'm talking about. But men have to be willing to do their huge piece of it on that side of it. You know, that's what has to happen now. And I don't know what the catalyst is. I wrote this book. That's my offering. But I think everybody's got to do their offering to say, okay, how do we catalyze this? How do we catalyze this? How do we make this the moment where we move into the time of American reckoning? Because if we don't, we are going to, this country is going to be, I don't even know what's ahead. I don't know what's ahead.
She's uplifting.
Well,
Like this.
uplift. It's work, right?
It is work. Speaking of uplifting, can we move on to how did you reconcile your feelings about your mother's complicity in the situation?
Love all the moaning. That was great. You know, I think one of the things I was talking to my dear friend Kim Crenshaw about. You all know Kim, who has coined the phrase intersectionality and done unbelievable work on looking at where race and gender cross and how they impact and what's the hierarchy and all those relationships. You know, we were talking about, like, what if we could begin to create structures in law where apologies became part of a process in communities. So where you as a victim could go to a prosecutor and you could say, I either want my perpetrator to be in prison, or I want my perpetrator to go through an apology process. And that would mean they would go through a few, whatever is designated time, working with clergy, working with a therapist, working with staff to actually go through that process. And then there'd be a panel of advocates, social workers, all kinds of people who would sit down and he would
decide how authentic it is.
What?
And decide how authentic the
yes,
apology is.
And you as the victim would decide whether whether you had that alchemy in you. And we were talking about that and one of the things we were talking about is how do you then impact the enablers, the people who enabled that perpetrator to do what they did and didn't stand up, and that would be a way that the community could be involved in that process so everyone would get to change. I think for my mother was of a generation where men determined everything, where men made the money, where men called the shots. In some ways, she was the fourth child. She was the child of my father. My mother came from a very poor upbringing in the Midwest, where my father had been the way out of that. And I think my mother absolutely chose economic security over the protection of me. And as a matter of fact, when I finally confronted my mother with this, which was probably one of the hardest moments of my life.
A long time ago, or?
Mm-hmm. And I went to Florida after my father had died, and I sat and I faced her, and I told her what my father had done. She certainly knew all the as a matter of fact, she said, well, I know he almost murdered you quite a few times, but I didn't know about the sexual, as if that was not a big deal, but that was the kind of, it's kind of a weird moment. But then when I confronted her about the sexual abuse, at first she was really, but then that morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, she called me up weeping, and she said, everything you're saying is true. Every single sign was there. You had infections, you had nightmares, you had personality changes, and she went through a lot of reckoning over the next years, and we went through a lot of processing. But at one point she called me and she said, I realized I sacrificed you. And I went, whoa. And it wasn't like I didn't know that, but it was when someone admits something to you, it was both relieving and horrifying. And she said, I could not imagine what I would have done to survive with 3 kids without your father. I didn't have a job, I didn't have money. And how many women are in that situation? I mean, and I'm not justifying their behavior, but when you don't have a way out in your head, you agree to a lot. You agree to a lot. And I'm really happy to say that my mother and I went through a long-term process before she died, and I feel we had a beautiful parting, and we got very clear, and I felt she made profound amends to me, and she's released, you know.
Do you want us to open up for questions?
Yes, why don't we do that?
All right.
Just a quick reminder about questions here. They generally start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are short. There is no such thing as a 2-part question. And tonight, Idina Menzel is the only person who gets to ask follow-up questions. Who would like to go first?
How do you write an apology for someone who's still alive and in denial?
Well, there was a wonderful journalist named Deccan Aikenhead who wrote a beautiful piece about this book, and she said to me during my interview, she said, I think every survivor should send this book to their abuser anonymously. And I thought that was a genius idea. So that might jiggle the denial. But I think it depends on what you want to do. If you want to do it for yourself, I think no matter what state your abuser's in, right, doing this exercise will help yourself. It will free something up in yourself. Other people have asked me, could I ask my abuser for an apology? And I have said, it really depends on how willing you think that person is. I wouldn't put myself in that position without feeling like there's an opening, and I certainly wouldn't put myself in that position without support. Because that's making yourself vulnerable again, and to get rejected on that again would be very painful. But I think I can only say this for me, that sitting down and writing what you want to hear, the words you want to hear, is so profound, because it actually gives you an idea of what you're missing. And it gives you an idea what this hole inside is about. And you begin to fill it up. And you're filling it up with you, but you're also taking agency over that. And I think one of the things that's happened to me since this book has been over, I don't think I was aware how deeply being a victim or a survivor to my father's abuser, how deeply that paradigm had framed my life. It was my life. It was the frame of my life. And at the end of this book, it felt like if I had brackets around me, they dropped down. I don't feel in that paradigm anymore. I do not feel a victim to anybody anymore. And that is so radical that I have moments like I feel like one of those baby doe, like I don't really know how to stand yet in this new reality, because I so much of my life has been about that. Every play I've written has been about that. Everything I've done, and that's not to say I won't forever work to end violence against women and girls. It's done. I've signed up for that. But it's going to be different. It's going to be different. So I just offered this up as a suggestion because I can only share my experience. It helped me a great deal.
Hi, I just want to ask, you alluded to this or started to a couple of times. it sounded like you felt in many cases that your father's voice was coming through you, not from you. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how you came to that?
Yeah, the through me from you is really, I'm not sure where it was. um, I will tell you something really odd. It's like I don't know a lot of the words my father uses in this book. Like his vocabulary is different than mine. His voice is authorial voice is different than mine. His formalness is different than mine. It shocked me how deeply he was literally speaking through me. And there were times when I would read back the next day what I had written, and I felt like, whoa, like that feeling. I think one of the amazing things about being an artist, and I think you will testify to this, is that we get to feel other people deeply. We get to allow them into us, and we get to go into them. And that's what we're doing here as human beings, isn't it? Feeling each other, having empathy for each other, having compassion for each other. And I think there were times when I would feel like he was speaking to me, and there were times he was speaking through me. And both things sometimes would happen at once. But what I realized is, until I made peace with him, he would always be speaking, he would always be controlling this story. This would be his story. I would be in his story. And I think women are trying to get to the new story, which is out of patriarchy. We're trying to break out of this story so we can imagine and figure out how we're going to keep life going on this planet. And so that's I feel like it was in me, through me, now it's out, you know? Yeah.
You've touched on this a couple of times, how there seems to be some kind of split in the perpetrators being or personality, where when they're in the act of doing this kind of abuse, they're not quite of themselves. They're acting. There's a denial or some sort of personality split where they may not fully realize what they're actually doing, and that allows them to further deny. And that seems like that's a really poor match for somebody who's going to get to the point where they can apologize, unfortunately. So I'm wondering what the research says about who gets to the point of these abusers, what do they need to go through in, I imagine, therapy, and they would have to voluntarily enter it to get to the point where they can recognize that they've done this to somebody and that they want to make an apology.
It's a really good question. You know, there's a wonderful program and a wonderful man named James Gilligan, and he's written 2 books, Violence and Preventing Violence. And he's run this program in a California prison for years, where he's worked with long-term men in prison who have done violent crimes. And his whole thesis is working on humiliation and shame, and really weaving and getting people to go back into their childhoods and their origins, looking at economic shame, racial shame, gender shame, and weaving the story back together so that people can see the parts of themselves where they've fractured and split off. And that program has a very, very low recidivism rate. Because, and there's actually programs like this beginning to happen, like a lot of restorative justice work and reparations programs. I think it's really critical that men who go through this process, I think it's degrees of splitting, right? There's some that's severe splitting, there's some that's, closer, My father would do things like he would choke me, and the next morning he would ask me where the marks were around my neck. And I'd be like, well, you put them, but I couldn't tell him that because then that would anger him. Do you know what I mean? So it was that constant, like, who did what separation, and also there was alcohol involved. So that's another piece of it. But I think obviously there are therapists who are doing this work, and I know some of them, and I think they're all around the country, who are beginning to work with men to help them go through a process. But men have to be willing and want to do this, right? And figuring out what the catalyst for that is the $10 million question, you know?
Yeah, I think you're saying if you dissociate and block it out, how can you confront something you don't even know is inside you?
No, and it's, if people are saying to you, you're dissociated, what privilege unfortunately does, and what narcissism does, and what power does, is it makes you not care about what people are saying to you. So part of it is that that's what we're puncturing as well. I mean, there's layers of privilege, of male power, all of those things. And so part of, I mean, I can only say this, and I feel this so deeply. The tyranny of patriarchy has destroyed men in some ways much more than it's destroyed women, because it's torn them from their hearts. To live a life torn from your heart is just the most painful thing in the whole world. To be freed of patriarchy isn't just for women. It's for all of us. We all get to be freed into our humanity. This is not a women's issue. This is humanity. This is, you know. And so part of it is we have to stop framing this as a woman's issue. Look what we've done to the earth in our separation from the earth. That's another one of those divides. Look what we're doing to immigrants and our separation from ourselves, who are all immigrants. Look at all the divides. It's dividing and dividing. That's what patriarchy does. Racist patriarchy is just dividing. It's like a cancer cell. Another divide inside another divide inside another divide. And it's destroying all of us. Does anyone think they're getting out of here when the tsunamis come? The rich and the powerful, they can build their little underground things. Where are they going to eat from? Where are they? It's all of us. So part of it is like, are men really going to allow themselves to wake up to where they are and understand that holding on to this power in a sinking ship is not going to do them any good? Where are you?
I'm in the middle right here.
Okay,
sort of.
thank you.
Yeah. As a middle and high school teacher, actually at this campus, where I'm looking at and in front of people who are across the gender spectrum and sexuality spectrum, and on that part of the journey from childhood to adulthood, there's so much conversation about men and women. So I'm just wondering what your wish is for, if there's a space at that part of the human journey to be having a conversation that's planting seeds to break this down. What's your wish? What would you love teachers to be talking with people at this part of the journey before they enter manhood, womanhood, or anything in between?
I think, for me, there would be two pieces to this story. Allowing every child to know what they are feeling, and to feel what they are feeling without shame or humiliation or forcing them into some idea of what they should be feeling. That's number one. Because I think that's where it all begins. That we're not allowed, I live in a community with a lot of, with wonderful, wonderful people, and particularly gay men. And the longer I'm with them, and I've seen, for example, what they've been through, because they expressed their so-called feminine sides, whether they wanted to dress up as fairies or dance with sparkle, or whether things made them cry or they expressed tenderness. I have to tell you, just the longer the stories, they make me weep. They make me weep to think that people are born with such tenderness and such openness and such beauty, and it gets cauterized and it gets smashed and it gets destroyed. And I think that's where it all starts. And some people keep their fairy wings on, and some people get machetes. And it's just, who knows why personalities go different ways, but I think that's number one. And the other thing I think is critical to talk about is sex. Because I think part of what happens in this country that is such a weird combination of being all exposed and totally puritanical all at the same time, right? It's the most bizarre mindfuck of a country, right? Like, right? It's like, whoa, okay, what do you mean, whoa, right? We don't talk to our children about sexuality. We don't teach them that it's the most beautiful thing in the whole world, that it's their life force, and it's in the trees, and it's in the birds, and it's in the wind, and it's in the sky, and it's in their vaginas and their penises, and it's fantastic. Instead, we cover it, and we put shame around it, and we put secrecy around it, and we're terrified to talk about it, and we're just all weird about it. And so they get all weird about it, and they get all shut down about it, as opposed to just being naturally in the flow of things and knowing they have rights to their bodies, to protect their bodies, that their bodies are beautiful and they own them, and they can choose when someone touches them. We don't protect them. We leave them completely wide open. And so how many people have told me on this tour across the country, I had no one to tell when my uncle touched me. I had no one to tell when my father invaded me, when my stepfather, there was no one. Why is that? Why is that? Because we don't tell children anything about anything. And we don't let them know that we're their allies and we will protect them and they can come to us. So I would talk about sex all the time. And I would show them pictures and images and know their bodies and feel good about their bodies and celebrate their bodies and not grow up with this horrible shame that has coated this country.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Can I just interject real quick? I have a question.
Yeah.
How do we do that as a mom, asking a mom? I feel like I do a lot of that, but I also feel that I also have to warn him about the evil in the world, and to tell him when he goes away to his sleepaway camp, as much as he loves it, and there are all these amazing people, that there are these, if there's, as much as he loves this older counselor, nobody takes out their penis in front of you, nobody, this is your body. It's really hard to talk about the beauty of this world and the evil of this world at one time, especially with little kids. It's hard to reconcile that.
But I think I always think of my beautiful granddaughter Coco, who's here tonight, and she'll probably laugh when I tell this story, but because this is really like that. I was living in Paris, and she was visiting me right when she was coming into her incredible life force and sexuality, and she was like 13, and we were going out, and I looked at her and I went, "Have you forgotten your clothes?" And because she was wearing like nothing, and and she went, "Bubby, my short skirt," like this piece that I wrote about girls in their short skirt, right? And she started to repeat it, "my short skirt," and everything under it is mine. I was like, okay, I'm screwed, right? I'm totally screwed, okay? And then I realized, okay, I don't want her to be terrified, but on the other hand, I don't want her to be unprotected. I don't want her not to feel good about wearing her short skirt on the street and feeling good about her body and being in her body, but I'm not going to say we're not in non-patriarchy. Mm-hmm. We're still in patriarchy. So part of it is, how do you say, this is really hard to say, I want you to feel as good and powerful and wonderful as you feel as you possibly can in your body, and I want you to be aware of the field and know that there are people who don't share the same reality we're in. And let's have summers where you can go naked and run in the fields and be with my women friends, which we do every summer, and where that's free space. And let's have awareness that this is still the world of patriarchy. Because the truth of the matter is, if our children know that there is free space and beautiful space, and that's a world we're creating and that's where we're going, they can figure out that there are the bad people and the good people and the good spaces and the bad. But if we don't talk about it, then they don't have any idea what's going on. When someone touches them, when someone asks them to do something, and then they don't have anyone to tell about it when it happens. And so it gets buried and it gets sat on, Yeah. So we had one more.
Hi. My family member was murdered. It's a cold case, so I have accepted that it's likely that I will never know who the perpetrator was. What really appealed to me about the work that you've done is tonight you shared how complete you feel with that inside yourself. And so as somebody who does not have the option of asking my human perpetrator to apologize, I'm aware that there's a lot of different ways to heal. So what about this way, as opposed to other ways of therapy, allowed you to come to real full and authentic liberation inside yourself? Because that's what I really want to go for now.
Thank you for sharing that. Was that a question?
Yeah.
What about?
What about?
How did you?
Like doing this as opposed to speaking to a therapist, as opposed to
She did that
EMDR,
too,
as
probably,
opposed
right?
to other ways.
You know what? I'm like 66. I have done everything in the possible world. No, really. I mean, really. If you've named it, whether it's breath work, dye work, live work, jump work, 12-step programs. I mean, there are many roads to nirvana, right? I would say, if you're going to do this, do it with somebody. Do not do this alone. One of the things I discovered is I woke up a week after I finished the book, and I had this really strange image in my third eye that just wouldn't go away. And it was a mandala, and inside the mandala there was another circle, and inside that there was a doorway. And I was like, oh my God, I'm looking at the wound. And what I realized is that I had a different idea of the wound. I didn't understand that the wound had a doorway. And that what I had done with the wound is that I had always parked my car or my buggy or my bicycle or a scooter, as the case of LA these days. I had parked it outside the wound, right? I'd kept it there. But if you keep it there, what happens is you get all the radiation that's falling down on you from the wound. If you're willing to go through the wound, it's like very, very, very choppy for a while, like in Top Gun. You remember that scene when they go through that thing? But afterwards, you get into clear space. If you go through the wound, you actually get to the other side of it. And I think we're taught in this country to be afraid of the pain. Afraid of the pain, afraid of the pain. That's why opioids. We're on. It's like, don't go near the pain. The pain is the passageway. The pain is the passageway. But you can't do it alone. You got to have support. You got to have friends. You got to have all kinds of people by your side. And if you have 6 or 3 or 2 good support, you can do it. But you can't do it alone. And I think we have to stop resisting the pain, because that's why we're not dealing with our history. We don't want to go back and touch that pain. We are all part of that legacy. That we carry that legacy. We carry the legacy of the indigenous, we carry the legacy of African Americans, and we carry the legacy of our families. And we got to go through the wound in order to get to the other side. So.
And our final question for the evening.
First of all, thank you. And my question is, what do you say to women who, basically, generally speaking, Republican women, who enable really the terrible situation we're in, not only now, but for the past my entire life, actually. So.
Wait, which women?
Republican women.
Oh. Those women. I wrote a piece, I don't know if you saw it, called Dear White Woman, around the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And this is what I feel. I feel, I have a good friend who's doing really good work and traveling around to a lot of parts of the country talking to those women, women who voted for Trump, for example. And what she's discovering is a lot of those women are in marriages where they're afraid, right? And that they're either violent relationships or controlling relationships where somebody has the economic purse strings, or where they've just been women who've been raised up to believe men have the power and should have the power. again, how do we get under that? How do we reach out to those women? How do we talk to those women? How do we make those women safe? How do we give those women another alternative, another vision, so they can begin to find their voice and to find their power? And I heard a really great story when I was in Brownsville, Texas. I was down there a few months ago talking to undocumented and seeing sites that I wish I had never seen. 1,400 boys warehoused in a former Walmart's. Okay, I actually saw that. But one of the workers there was telling me this story that a whole group of evangelist women had come to tour the shelters and the detention centers, and they had a whole idea of what undocumented people were. And when they got there, their minds were blown. And they've gone back now and they've started this whole new group, much to the chagrin of their husbands, speaking out. So part of it was literally they needed to see and they needed to be touched and they needed to hear something different than what they've been hearing. People are being fed Fox News and they've been mainlining toxins and toxins and toxins. It's like, how do we reach out to people and feed them different kind of food? And that's the only thing I know. And I really believe that is our work if we are going to free ourselves from the current predator-in-chief and move to a different state of existence. We have to reach out to people who are not thinking like us and talk to them and find out why they are feeling what they're feeling and begin to see if we can communicate. Because we need to win this next election. That is just definite.